Welcome to Upside, where we look at the real stories that live behind the headlines affecting European venture. Today, it's Mads, Lomax, and myself, and we are talking about war, very sadly. We're talking about how the EU is navigating this new defense push. Lots of money being spent on defense. We're looking at the European Space Agency, who are looking for money to build a new satellite network with military capabilities. We've got a bit on the US, China slugging it out and what's happening with Europe. What does that mean for us over here? We are going to look at a pumping American IPO market, and then one from Lomax, a very cool British surgical robots tool, which we're going to look at how that's going to make waves and create some surgical magic.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
Now, starting at the top, Mads, I think we're going to lean on you heavily for this one because we can't not talk about war. We can't not talk about what's going on in Iran, what's happening with Israel, what's happening with the US, obviously Russia, Ukraine, and how this reshuffling of the world order is going to pare down and affect what we're doing at an investment at a startup level. So can you kick us off with war?
There is so much to unpack there. I think everybody knows what's going on right now in Iran and Israel. I don't think we need to talk about the specifics of what's happened this week, but maybe just taking a step back, I think it's worth reflecting on how we got here, because this is a completely unpredictable turn of events that I think, going back just 12 months, none of us could have seen that we would get here. And so, just going backwards to February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, expecting a quick victory. But Ukraine's resistance really decimated the Russians' offensive capabilities at the time and forced a resource prioritization for the Russians. Now, throughout the war that's ensued since then, Iran has supplied attack drones to Russia, and they've done that in a quite meaningful way. Now, fast forward to last year, September 2024, Israel severely weakened Hezbollah. They killed Nasrallah, and on September 27th, reduced capabilities by up to 70% of Hezbollah. That has previously been, a huge threat to Israel, kind of the state-sponsored sort of terror organization, right? That was seen by Iran as the boot that was there to kind of choke Israel and threaten the country. And so by December, Assad's regime collapsed because Russia, now bogged down in Ukraine, was not able to support their old ally, Assad. And Hezbollah, that was now decimated, couldn't come to his rescue. That meant that Assad fell. That cut Iran's land route to Lebanon and meant that rather than having two adversaries on Israel's borders, now both of those adversaries within a few months were gone. And so this is really what enabled Israel to strike at Iran's nuclear facilities. So 200 fighter jets targeting more than 100 targets last week and have been in this process of dismantling the nuclear capabilities since then. And I think it's worth reflecting on the role of Iran, not just in the region, but on a global scale. Over the past several years, Iranian terrorism has reached, all parts of the world. We've had terror attempts in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in France. We've had attempted kidnappings in New York, not to talk about what the country has done to, and for the stability and destability of the Middle East. You have a huge Iranian diaspora, kind of more than 4 million people. From what we know, the vast majority supports a new regime in Iran. And so you've got kind of these very, very interesting dynamics happening where really all of this started with Ukraine's resistance that weakened Russia, that meant that, Israel was able to strike at Iran at this time. And look, there are lots of risks on the horizon here, but there is a possibility, I think, for a reorientation of the Middle East. If you could get a more benign, a more productive regime in Tehran, that would be a huge outcome for everybody. Yes, risks, but certainly also potential for upside. And I think it's worth, we often talk about defense on this show. obviously goes to show that defense is as important as ever. This is certainly not a peaceful world we live in.
We're going to talk about defense a bit more later. Do you think that World War III or the proxy World War III has already started?
I don't think so. I think Putin has already been out to say that this is a matter between Israel and Iran. I think the Chinese are too smart to get involved here in a meaningful way. So no, I actually don't think so.
But everyone is selling drones to everybody. It feels like there's quite a clean divide with this proxy war going on in the Middle East. It just feels
Look, there are risks. There are risks for sure. I do think the upsides at this juncture are possibly bigger than the downsides. I think that the Iranian regime has been terrorizing the region for 40 years. It can hardly get much worse. And being on the threshold of nuclear power was obviously, nuclear weapons was obviously a bridge too far for pretty much everybody in the Western world. I mean, even beyond, right? Maybe even Japan kind of was out saying that there's just no way that Iran can get nuclear weapons. So I think everybody's agreed there.
Lomax, this obviously has ramifications for us, for oil, for stability. What else would you add?
Yeah, I think apart from just being a little bit more nervous generally around a more unsettled world, is what does this mean for financial markets, right? Both public and private. So Brent crude oil is up. Shot up 10% this week from $70 to $77, maybe touching 80.
That doesn't seem like a sizable spread for such a massive...
It's already high. It's already been driven up high. Some of this was already priced in. Clearly, Iran and the US have been in negotiations over the last few months, and also it's also priced in by the fact what's going on with the Houthis in Yemen, right? So I think that's had some impact on price. But some are saying this could now go up to $120 per barrel. Just as a reminder, a majority of the world's oil that comes out of the Gulf obviously comes through the Straits of Hormuz, which is between Oman and Iran. So I think 15 million barrels a day. So the heightened risk in Iran puts pressure on this, will increase shipping rates, etc. What does this actually mean for us? Well, look, as I said, more instability, a little bit more risk off on the investment perspective. So you can see that in the markets today. So US dollar, Swiss franc, gold, all up, areas where you traditionally fly to safety when things get more choppy. Equity markets in the EU and the US down. I mean, not down by a lot, like single-digit %. What does this also mean? More importantly, I think, is on a longer-term basis, if oil prices stay high, is inflation. The higher oil rises, the more generally, the more we see inflation. So this will therefore, as we discussed here before, potentially impact interest rates. And you've seen the Bank of England today have held and not cut, which looking back 2-3 weeks ago, there was the potential that the Bank of England in today's announcement would cut by 0.25%. They haven't done that, so they've held at 4.25%.
And the Fed is still holding fast as well. I saw.
Exactly. But there was a chart. I mean, obviously the EU have been cutting, right? We talked about that last time, and there are other reasons, particularly behind that. In the UK, there was an expectation possibly there was going to be a cut, but that's been held, and they quoted this unrest and unsettled Middle Eastern situation as one of the reasons for that. So, this is all big macro stuff. Does this really, impact founders down in the trenches and GPs investing in those founders on a day-to-day basis? No, but if it leads to a flight away from riskier assets, i.e. equities, then there'll be less funding available for us in the long term. But it's too early to tell. We'll see where this gets to.
Yeah, a lot will depend on how protracted the conflict is.
Yeah, and Mads, I mean, you're very optimistic on what could replace the regime in Iran, but fingers crossed, it could be worse. I mean, I don't think it will be worse actually, but it's hard to imagine.
That's true. That's true. I've seen Netanyahu supporters in Iran. I don't know how popular the regime is. I guess we'll never get any kind of proper honest overview as to 90 million inhabitants in Iran. I guess we'll never know, but I've seen, and maybe it's good old solid Israeli PR, but I've seen BB fans in Tehran.
Well, of course, if you're against the regime, Israel's the quickest way to get rid of the regime, right?
Let's stay with defense. So defense, my personal take is the defense is gonna save Europe financially. I think we're going to see so much because of resilience tech. It's so deep, it's so wide. There's going to be so much money flowing because of this new isolationism that Trump has given us permission to get out there on our own. And I think that activity is going to come all the way down to what we're doing. I think even though I hate the notion of war, I think that, upside, obviously money and flow will circulate. Downside, it's a really sad time for humanity. However, for investors and startups, there will be activity. There's going to be more stuff coming down the track. So there are lots of stories this week about how the EU is navigating this new defense push. Lomax, set the scene a bit and let's dig into some of the details.
Yeah, well, I'll just start. I mean, reflecting on what you just said, I mean, I think that's a little bit optimistic, Dan, to be honest, especially in the context of venture and technology. If you're thinking that defense is really the silver bullet, or certainly a big growth factor.
I think money's going to flow. I think it's going to create money flow.
Defense tech within VC was 1.7% of the market last year, right? So it really is a very, very small part. So even if that increases fivefold, it's still not moving the needle at the cohort level.
But
right,
defense is, my point is, defense is not just defense anymore. Defense is energy, it's food security. There's a whole layer to the onion that I think comes with this renewed resilience.
I guess that's the broader resilience category that VCs are now touting, and yes, and so energy sovereignty, etc. But yes, if you include that category, then you're talking about more like 25 to 30% of overall European venture investments are touched by that kind of resilience, sovereignty angle. But I mean, if we're talking about defense specifically, right, it is still a very, very small component. Now, of course, the budgets here are increasing significantly. So the UK Office Spending Review, as we talked about here 2 weeks ago, has now pledged to spend up certainly 2.5% by 2027 of GDP on defense, increasing to potentially 3% in the next parliament. So actually, in real terms, looking at the numbers from, say, 2015, the UK annual defense budget will have jumped from 35 billion to roughly 85 billion. So nearly a kind of 2.5 to 3x increase in 10 years. The EU is increasing as well, going from 1.6% of GDP in 2023 to ideally 3% in 2030. So these are big numbers. So actually in the EU defense budget is going to increase from 280 billion to 426 billion. So these are big numbers. What are we seeing at this? How are we seeing that trickle down to startups? Well, actually, there have been 3 unicorns minted in the last 24 months within EU and UK defense. So Helsing, how much are they? 600 million, adding 12 billion
euros at 12 billion.
12 billion valuation, which is quite incredible, making it one of the top 5 privately valued startups in Europe. So that's been a phenomenal and very, very quick ascent. Takiva, Portuguese company operating in drones, and Quantum Systems out of Munich. So those are 3 kind of newly minted unicorns that are riding this wave. So I think, we're seeing that down now at our level. And Helsing, interestingly, now has started out within software, is now producing its own drones, looking to go into submarines and aircraft. So it's going from software to all domain. There is a general rush of VCs into this category, which, I think I've said before, when I see VCs rushing towards something, I tend to rush in the other direction. Like, what did to be my initial reaction?
The Patagonia vests and the paddles.
Yeah, and I think this is great. Look, I mean, if you look at the market size and the headline numbers I just gave, you've got very, very big budgets increasing pretty rapidly. You could probably find markets growing faster in other sectors, right, that are potentially sexier from a venture and entrepreneur perspective, but this is still, these are doubling, potentially trebling on a kind of decade basis. So the CAGR, the compounded annual growth rate of these markets, is not something to forget about. But just to put that in context, health in the US is 20% of GDP. Defense is 2.5 to 3% of GDP, right? So it's still a lot smaller than these other big areas, but still, it's nothing to shy away from. However, I think just a few words of caution. Let's not forget, technology, which is really what we're talking about here, is only roughly 10% of these budgets, right? So all of these big numbers we just talked about, you need to cut in 10, right? Secondly, these are very atypical investments from a venture capital perspective in terms of they have a number of obstacles, which can both be benefits if you surmount them, right? Because they give you a moat that other traditional, for example, business-to-business, B2B software companies didn't have, right? So, including, these are the sort of problems that I think through when I think of defense. Very, very, very long sales cycles where often distribution trumps innovation, small buyer universe, right? You've only got 25 to 30 potential buyers, and that's complicated by joint procurement. So in the EU, everyone joins together to procure. So in a way, you've suddenly taken 20 countries and combined them into one, right? highly political, highly regulated, export controls on weapons, etc., and a constrained exit environment. So I think all of these are tricky issues to navigate. Clearly, there could well be a kind of winner-takes-all aspect here, which is what clearly a lot of VCs believe Helsing could be. But look, I think there's something very, very interesting here as warfare gets upgraded for the modern age with the adoption of robotics and AI, autonomous systems, etc. You've seen the big first movers, Anduril, which is now valued at 31 billion in the US, Helsing now valued at 12 billion in Europe. This is all exciting. These are potentially very, very big companies, but I think definitely buyer beware, caveat emptor, with respect to just rushing into the latest defense craze and thinking you want to make money.
I think Lomax captured it well. An angle I thought it was worth just noting is looking at the consortium that's come together to fund this Helsing round. So it's Lightspeed Ventures, so that's US money. It's Accel, that's US money. It's General Catalyst, US money. Okay, so the two main European investors are, it's Plural, which is Tavid from TransferWise, his shop, and then it's Daniel Ek from Spotify.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, kind of this defense VC taboo has been broken. But even so, Daniel Ek, he's been criticized. But he's also said, look, I firmly believe that this is the right thing for Europe.
I thought Saab was in there.
Saab is a defense company. I mean, I think that makes sense that a defense company would invest. But if you talk about venture, kind of these are the venture dollars. And I think what's interesting is there's been lots of US money coming in, but it took some homegrown capital to prime the pump. And especially Daniel's work here has done that. And that's why we need more homegrown VC firms if we want to build these champions. So, I think, Lomax, to your point, we still have a 10x funding gap versus the US when we look at the defense tech ecosystem. So there's still a lot to do. And later we'll touch on the China and Europe trade challenges that are very connected to this.
I think it's very interesting you pick this up, Mads, in respect of the US venture money coming in. Let's not forget that in European venture capital, the EIF is roughly, the European Investment Fund is roughly 50% of the capital into the venture funds in Europe. And in the UK, the British Business Bank, the equivalent is roughly 35 to 40%, okay? When those funds invest in a venture capital fund, they put restrictions and they say, no sex, no gambling, no weapons. Yeah, you look in the schedule of the limited partnership agreements of the funds in which those people invest, you cannot do those three things. They're absolute prohibitions, which is why, for example, when you see funds like Boulderton, which I think have government money, I don't know, but I think, the big fund in the UK, they invest in Quantum Systems, which is this Munich drones company. It's billed as a dual use investment. Yeah, because and in the press releases, they emphasize the civilian use cases because I suspect the wording will say something like, you cannot invest in companies that primarily make weapons and arms and ammunition. So they kind of get around it on this legal technicality. So obviously Daniel Ek doesn't have that restriction. He puts a lot of money into Helsing, which is a pure defense company. Plural, I don't know what their LP base looks like, but I suspect they haven't got government money in there, so they have this freedom. And the problem is that these funds are 10 years long. So in a way, these decisions were made 3 or 4 years ago to kind of tie the hands of these funds. And so we haven't seen, I don't know, if you're raising a new fund from the EIF now, can you actually get this struck out? We saw the head of the EIF the other day saying, we're still not going to be investing in weapons and arms and ammunition. So this is a major difference because we have such a big government presence. And let's not forget also, if you have a fund that's a 200 million fund and the EIF puts in 50 million into that fund, their restriction taints the whole fund, right? So you actually end up tying the hands of more than just the capital that they deploy. You end up potentially, tying the hands of, 2 to 3x the amount of capital they deploy. So I don't want to be a negative Nancy or whatever on this, but this is one of the reasons why, you actually find it difficult if you're a pure defense company to raise money from a lot of venture funds. Now, and that's also why you'll see fund companies like Tekiva, Quantum Systems, and the next ones, there'll be a big amping in dual use, and that's fine. That's a bigger dual use, makes it a bigger market opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. But that's what's going on behind the scenes.
I wonder where there'll be a semi turning of the head just to let some things flow through. But Mads, one other thing I wanted to ask you was, what was the blowback with Daniel Ek?
Well, Spotify is a music company, and what is the music maestro doing investing in weapons is the complaint some people have had, because, right? I mean, for many people, they don't
Ideologically different, is that?
It's just the ideology, and he said he thinks it's the right thing, and of course, the truth of the matter is we need to be able to defend ourselves, otherwise we can't enjoy our music. I mean,
he was one of the first investors. I mean, Helsing is only a 4-year-old company, and he was one of the first investors.
Absolutely. And that's what he had flak for. Obviously, it's a new world today. I'd say, Lomax, just on the point you made, you're absolutely right about the EIF. BBB doesn't have the same restrictions. Yes, no sex, no gambling, but no problems with defense.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, what I would say is, that's great to hear that, maybe that's a Brexit. No, it's not a Brexit dividend, because the British Business Bank has always been independent. I would just say, look, I think we live in our little world of early stage, venture and innovation and technology, and we can see the pressing issues within defense and technology. But I think at the wider level, it's not inherently obvious to be investing in weapons. And I can see why Daniel Ek gets flack from some people in society. And yeah, I don't necessarily agree with those people, but if you're going to invest in things like weapons, you're going to get flack. But, if you put yourself out there and do something, someone's always going to try and take you down, which I think is part of the course.
Well, he is standing by his own values, which he's done a number of times. I mean, I remember the Joe Rogan blow up, and there've been a number of Daniel Ek surrounding kind of challenges about his politics or ideology. But I think, if that's what you stand for, then good for him. He's standing for what he believes in. And
but I think broadly, look, I mean, what are we saying here? We're saying much bigger budgets for defense. We now have a reference. You always got to have a reference company in an industry. We now have a very, very strongly emerging reference company in Helsing, which you can look and point to. And when I raise money from my LPs, et cetera, like the fact they've heard of Helsing is generally helpful when you're trying to talk through an investment category. So it's great to have a reference, and I think we'll see, what we've already seen on the ground, day to day, founders working on interesting problems. And it's not just weapons, all of this stuff there's a whole bunch of upgrading that needs to happen after basically 50 years of not investing at all.
We are seeing more defense dual use in our deal flow. That's absolutely for sure. Again, we're going to stay with defense. It's very defense heavy this week. So the European Space Agency is looking for €1 billion to build a satellite network with military capabilities. This is just the opening budget, is going for approval in November. What's the story behind the story here, and what are the broader implications for Europe?
I think it's tied to the same theme, basically. In terms of the EU upgrading systems and grabbing hold of sovereignty and control over as many critical capabilities and infrastructures that it can, right? And we talked about this across energy, across AI, and obviously you're seeing it in defense. And this is adjacent to that, which is Earth observation. The EU has had its own Earth observation system, which is called Copernicus, but generally been very, very lightweight in historically. And so that's been, I think Copernicus has 15 satellites, something like that. Whereas the US has both the military grade satellites for Earth observation have been generally delegated to the individual nation states within Europe. So there's been like less of a kind of a militaristic push at the European level. And that has meant that historically for Earth observation data, Europe has relied heavily on both US military, US civilian, and US private. So you often read, when you look at articles about Ukraine or something, you see an image, and in the bottom right-hand corner, you see Maxar Technologies or Planet Labs, right? These are US private companies, right, that have put up tons of satellites and are selling them to, obviously the press, but also actually to European governments, it turns out, right? So the European Space Agency has suddenly realized now, okay, Earth observation is critical. We are now, the Space Agency is now asking for 1 to 2 billion, which will actually end up becoming 5 to 6 to 7 billion, over the life of this project, to effectively double or treble the number of satellites that can be used for Earth observation, particularly with a military focus. So it's again part of taking back sovereignty. Why is this relevant? Well, it continues the same theme, but I think interestingly, there will be opportunities here for both, hardware and software companies that can, tender for some of these projects, So as the European Space Agency puts out requests for, people to build the satellites, or people to build systems for the satellites, or people to build imaging for the satellites, there will be opportunities And crucially, this time, given that the Europe is trying to build more sovereignty and control, it will mean that probably European companies have a greater chance than their American cousins, who are probably better funded and more advanced, etc. But actually, the Europeans won't want to integrate them into this kind of critical infrastructure. So I think there's a company called ICEYE out of Finland, which both manufactures and operates satellites. I think it's raised over 500 million. They could be a classic beneficiary of this, but they'll actually be seed stage and Series A stage companies that will also benefit. So I think this plays into the same theme, but certainly interesting. And it's also just reminds you, it's like, European governments and the EU have just been relying on US private commercial companies for this critical data. It's like, come on, guys, you've been asleep at the wheel. It's an abject policy failure that we've seen at the UK and the EU level.
Well, I would just put it in the context of IRIS, which is Europe's Starlink competitor. Now, of course, the Earth observation network is different. This is, as Lomax is saying, this is ESA's new intelligence network. So this is more about the eyes and the ears. There are some similarities here, and it's all about plugging Europe's gaps in infrastructure and communication. In some ways, the technologies are complementary. The new constellation here could consume the IRIS bandwidth, and IRIS in turn would benefit from sort of some of these security hardening aspects of the EO project. And there's clearly a defense angle, as Lomax is saying. Now, put this in the context of Starlink. So
please don't.
Starlink, independent analysts are saying it's cost 16 to 18 billion so far. Elon Musk's own guidance was it would be 20 to 30 before he felt it was sort of fully deployed over the life cycle, and that it would take 5 to 10 billion to reach break even. The truth is, we've had rumblings about when access to the US systems could be switched off, and clearly strategic autonomy in comms and surveillance is absolutely essential. And so if we don't have an ironclad agreement with the Americans, then Europe must have our own systems. That's the way it has to be. But if we compare our systems, look at it's fewer satellites, it's lower coverage, it's potentially higher latency. It's a very long road to commercialization, if ever. And so one could wish maybe for a more commercial approach to projects like IRIS than the one that's been taken. But it is interesting to see that we are at least starting to take the strategic autonomy seriously. And I do hope the budget will be approved for the investment.
And one thing that's interesting also as a tangent here is that that NASA's funding is proposed to be cut by the White House by 25%. It will be the smallest NASA budget since 1961. So funnily enough, what's going on while the European Union is increasing budgets for the European Space Agency, the US is doing the opposite with NASA. And the same is true in defense. We just talked about European defense budgets going up. The US is cutting its defense budget. I mean, the US defense budget is still nearly 1 trillion. It's still nearly double what the European is, right? But it's still kind of going in opposite directions. I mean, I think maybe in the US they're thinking that the private sector will pick up more of this is probably that's probably a very slightly more libertarian, White Houseian or Trumpian philosophy.
Or maybe thinking that Europe will pick up some of our own costs to defend ourselves.
Yeah.
That's definitely. Isn't much of the saving or much of the budget cut in NASA? Isn't it much of the R&D to spend? Aren't the Trumpians cutting any kind of scientific R&D? Isn't that always feels like it's the biggest sledgehammer they want to take to the budget?
They want to cut everything: fat, administrative burden, all of it. So yes.
Even so, the big beautiful bazooka bill is adding $2-3 trillion to the fiscal deficit. So,
but what's also interesting, is that actually because there is still a heavy collaboration between the European Space Agency and NASA, but actually now the NASA budget's being cut. Some of these joint projects they're working on are also getting cut, right? So I think the Lunar Gateway, which is a space station designed to orbit the moon, is going to be cut. It's interesting times, but at least I guess the European purse string holders are doing the right thing with regard to some of these critical areas.
Well, let's broaden it out, because we can't kind of not talk about China in the reshuffling of the global world order. And obviously there's a major trade war that's been going on for a decade or so between US and China. How will this affect Europe and how will this affect us? Mads, where would you take this?
It's closely linked to this discussion around strategic autonomy, because while the US has been rotating away from China for nearly a decade, EU imports have held up. About 25% of EU imports come from China, and it's now down to 15% for the US. And there are really three forces that explain the gap. One is we've had a very strong clean tech pull in Europe. So Europe was early around green transition policies, and that meant that there was a kind of a market acceptance of Chinese technologies and products within batteries, within EVs, within solar cells, within all these tech components that we needed, and China has been supplying. The second thing is an energy price shock, because after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, soaring energy prices in Europe have made it very expensive to manufacture here, especially things that are energy intensive, like chemicals production. And so it's been cheaper to import those from China, where energy is cheap. And then there is the third component, which the US and Japan, they relocated labor-intensive goods such as apparel and furniture and electronics and other things to Vietnam and Mexico and Bangladesh and elsewhere. But Europe largely did not, largely stayed with China. So we are as dependent on Chinese imports as we've ever been. Two things are happening right now in the context of the Trump trade wars. The first is that there is a fear that this European dependency on Chinese exports will be further accelerated due to the U.S. trade policy. So the recent trade numbers are telling a story here. In May, U.S. imports from China were down 34%, but EU imports were up massively. So Germany, more than 21%, France, more than 24%. So you're seeing a rotation of exports out of China to the US and then into Europe instead. And now this has actually come to the point where Brussels, they've sort of activated an emergency trade surveillance system to flag any goods rerouting, because there's a fear that we're just going to have a lot of Chinese goods dumped here in Europe. Now, at the same time, and this is the strategic piece, Europe is hit by the same rare earths fight that's been happening in the US. And there are real supply chain issues now, especially in automotive. But this could also impact defense, linking back to the discussion we just had. Beijing has recently agreed to fast-track approvals for some rare earth export licenses, but it's now done on a tactical basis. So the European industry, especially automotive and also defense, is now to some extent at China's mercy. And that obviously connects to, as we say, defense. It also connects to energy. It connects to energy transition and renewables and wind turbines, etc. So many aspects of this to consider as we look at the shifting global trade landscape.
What are we going to do, Mads? Should we go and speak to your brethren, the Danes, and get Greenland, get mining? What do we do?
Oh, I thought you were suggesting the Vikings should jump back in the longboats and go to raids.
Well,
raids.
that also, but should we? Yeah, but I don't think Greenland is the silver bullet. But being unable to rely on critical materials like that is definitely a problem, right?
Absolutely. And we need to have a short-term strategy and a longer-term strategy for this, because obviously we can't have the European defense and automotive supply chain be idle for 4 years. But so we need kind of short-term to make agreements with China and others so we can keep having access to the materials.
Let me tell you something really smart. Announce that you're increasing your defense budgets by tens of billions. Oh, and then realize you need to go and ask China for more rare.
Well, what else would you add, Lomax? So obviously there's going to be
just
a
say
European impact. It's going to come downstream.
We're talking about,
where are we going to go?
This kind of global trade and tariffs. Let's not forget, we got the 9th of July deadline coming up, right? Trump had paused the Liberation Day tariffs. They kick up again very soon, 2-3 weeks time. And in the intervening period, the UK and the US have agreed a sort of mini trade deal of sorts. And the EU is trying to do the same. Slightly more difficult for the EU because the EU is a net exporter to the US, whereas the UK is a net importer from the US. So we all know Trump hates importing more than exporting, right? So he has the EU more on his sights than the European, than the British. But I think the Europeans are trying to agree a deal. And it looks like the kind of 10% baseline, which is applied pretty much to most UK goods exported to the US, with the odd exception, will apply. But that's certainly better than the 50% that Donald Trump has been threatening. And then actually slightly worryingly, Trump this week has said that pharmaceuticals are now in his sights. We've seen before that pharmaceuticals were exempt from tariffs, but actually the EU exports at least 100 billion of pharmaceutical products to the US. So that could be, and obviously home in Denmark, Mads, of Novo Nordisk, which was once the most valuable company in Europe, now still up there. So this is definitely a big problem in one of the critical industries in the EU. So let's see where that goes to.
We've got an absolutely pumping IPO market in the US, despite all the trade wars and the real wars, faltering bond markets and all kinds of volatility. The IPO market is really on fire, up around 30% or so in 25 compared to the same period last year. Now, for context, there are around 25 million private companies in the US compared to 4,500 public. In 2025, it feels like private is finally going public. The floodgates have opened. Is this short term? Is it inertia? Is it just AI? Mads, what's happening over there and how is this going to affect us over here?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of all of the above. But I mean, just recapping some of the really incredible things that have happened here in the last few weeks for folks that haven't been paying close attention. So Chime just IPO'd on the NASDAQ on the 12th of June. Now, for Europeans that don't know Chime well, it's sort of a little brother to Revolut. Not as cool, not as feature-rich, not as many customers, not as much revenue. A good company, but Revolut is much cooler in so many ways. But anyway, back to Chime.
It's European, baby.
Yeah, well, do you know what? It is really one of the shining icons for us. Chime IPO'd and they popped 59% on the debut, right? So the share price just popped right up. The Circle IPO, so the USDC, the stable coin, they IPO'd earlier in June. They IPO'd at $31. It's now trading above $200. Okay, that's in less than a month. We have CoreWeave that IPO'd at $40, now trading up at $170. All right, so suddenly it feels a little bit like 1999 all over again.
Prince is turning in his grave, baby.
Listen, I'm just old enough to remember, and it's sort of that sweet smell of youth or sweet sound of youth or whatever. Now, the pipeline for IPOs is suddenly full. Klarna, Gemini, Cerebras are all filing. They're all in the waiting room. Lots of capital has been raised this year. Of course, the question is, what's the European angle and where are our IPOs? Klarna is the only major European name right now that I can think of in the pipeline. And then there is also the London Stock Exchange versus NASDAQ angle. Now, ARM chose the US, and more will follow unless London reforms, also something we've discussed before. So still uncertainty. We talked about July the 8th. If trade doesn't get resolved, the window could shut again. But if there's a resolution, there is evidence here that this market is red hot and ready to roll because of all this pent-up IPO demand.
I don't know if you listened to Bill Gurley on Invest Like the Best this week, former benchmark partner, but there's many things to unpack from that, and I'd highly recommend tuning into that if you haven't yet. But Bill Gurley kind of infamously hates the IPO market, hates all the bankers who effectively suppress the price of the IPO to basically benefit the insiders who benefit from this kind of IPO pop in the initial day of trading. And obviously don't forget that this is relevant because if you're raising money in an IPO, this is effectively the money at which you raise, the valuation at which you raise money. So it affects dilution. Actually what Bill was saying, amongst other things, is, well, actually in the moment, private markets are still pumping. Is that, well, I can be offered, I don't know, X valuation at the IPO market, and it's going to cost me a lot of money and costs to actually go through that process. And then there's the reporting burden afterwards. I'm getting much better valuations in the private markets, right? So interesting to see how that plays out. But in the short term, and let's see what happens on the 9th of July, again, this deadline on tariffs, which, the tariffs have been directly linked to the volatility in the equity market. So we'll see what happens. Maybe this window will close again. But one thing I will say is, baby, SPACs are back.
SPACs are back.
So, yeah, on that note,
oh my Lord,
it looks like there's article in the FT today basically saying that, yes, SPACs are back. And, when you see Goldman Sachs now getting back in on the action, that's the sort of ultimate kind of canary down the mine in that respect. So as a reminder, SPACs raised up to 170 billion worth of SPACs in 2021. This fell to 2 billion last year. This year is up 11 billion. So year to date, 11 billion. So it's already over five times what year to date was last year. Clearly it's 1/10 or even 1/20th of what it was at the peak, but still a little sign that the sort of market madness, as Mads just alluded to, is definitely back.
How many Trump children are there in each of these SPACs, do we think? How many Trump phones, Trump sneakers?
Children, sons-in-laws,
coins,
exactly, daughter-in-laws. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Lomax, we're gonna finish out on, you've got a very, very cool surgical robot that you wanted to have a chat about. And I think there's a broader topic here, but start with what's going on with this.
Well, I think it's cool. Like I think it's cool, but the context of this is that CMR Surgical, which used to be called Cambridge Medical Robotics because they are a medical robotics company based in Cambridge in the UK, founded in 2014, has raised $1 billion, has now grown to roughly, it's not disclosed, but roughly $100 million of sales, is now exploring a exit, has appointed bankers to explore an exit at the roughly, I think the last valuation in private markets was 3 billion. So looking at an valuation anywhere north of that, 3 to 4 billion. The sort of context here is, this is a cool company that has come out of Cambridge in a critical area, but at the same time, it's like, why are they looking to sell themselves now? Right? You know, surely there's a lot of value there they're leaving on the table here. So I think, you know, there's a good way to think about this is through the lens of comparing the big behemoth in the market, which is Intuitive Surgical Robot Company, right? Which actually is an absolute beast that effectively targets the same problem. So this is using robots in surgery, any different types of surgery. And the reason why that might be a good thing, clearly, is it might reduce costs. It might improve outcomes. One of the big reasons for this, it levels the playing field. So you can basically take moderately experienced surgeons and upgrade them by using the robot. The robot doesn't do the surgery by itself. It's done in a kind of human and machine fashion. You can level the playing field by effectively bringing up the kind of lower to mid-level experienced surgeons to the same level as the experienced run, right? Which is clearly a good thing for healthcare systems. Just look at Intuitive Surgical. So I just mentioned that CMR is looking at potentially exiting for $4 billion. Intuitive has a market cap of $180 billion, right? This company was founded a lot earlier. It was founded in the 90s, right? But it's phenomenal. It has $8 billion revenue, 30% EBITDA margin. Like that company develops the Da Vinci robot. The CMR Surgical has a robot called the Vercius robot. They both kind of retail between $1 to $2 million. So they're big ticket items for hospitals. But it's sort of an example where, you know, the UK in this case has done a good job of developing a company that's doing, you know, 100 to 200 million of revenue, that is one of the leaders in this field, but it's still a long way off Intuitive, right? But is now potentially putting itself on the block, having kind of gone through the difficult phase of getting the prototype into a kind of scaled up model that has passed regulation, that is adopted by hospitals, that is liked by doctors, and now they're looking potentially to sell themselves because they can't raise the capital to grow. I can only imagine.
Why?
So
is that the thesis?
Well, it's funny. There's an article in the FT which sort of focused on $100 billion that it was losing every year, but it's like that's I'm afraid that's the wrong thing to be focusing on. Clearly, it's going to be losing if it's still in growth mode and buying
It's
market
10 years
shares.
old, right? It feels quite young for this kind of offering.
100%. So I feel like it's good in some respects, but let's not forget a little acquisition that happened in 2007 for a company called Celexa, which I think sold for £700 million to Illumina. And Illumina then, you know, that technology that came out of Cambridge underpinned a lot of the product roadmap for Illumina, right, on its way to, at some point, being an $80 billion market company. Illumina now has its own problems. You know, we talked about this the other day in the context of Oxford Ionics, which just got bought by INQ in the US for $1 billion. It's like, this is great, like a $4 billion exit in UK tech. You know, it's nothing to poo-poo, but it's like, guys, come on. Like, where's the ambition here? Why don't we build companies of tens of billions of market cap rather than, you know, 100 million in revenue and then sell for 4 billion? And I don't know, like this, by the way, this is very, very close to my heart because, I actually used the intuitive robot was what I had surgery with, a year and a half ago. And it's phenomenal, right? I was walking the next day and was out of hospital 2 days later, having had half my colon removed, right? And I only have like 3 or 4 tiny little scars where it was done laparoscopically, keyhole surgery. So these things are incredible. And, it's great that the UK has got from 0 to 1 in creating a kind of challenger to the incumbent company, to incumbent in the US. But it feels like maybe yet again it's selling itself short. But again, maybe a 4 billion exit isn't something to sniff at.
Well, health services
mixed feelings
in the UK
as always.
Difficult, right? Well, it's difficult. I mean, a billion is nothing to be sniffed at, but it is. The UK is possibly not the right place to be building a healthcare service like this. But Mads, you've got some thoughts, I imagine.
You could probably argue the case either way. I think, Lomax, I'm exactly with you. I mean, we've got an NHS that's famously unproductive. And that's not something I'm saying to be mean. I mean, it's full of amazing people that are working hard and doing wonderful things. But at the macro level, the NHS has had an uplift of spending of roughly 12% in real terms since 2019. But productivity is down 5 to 6% since that pre-pandemic era. So this is something that would have been unheard of if it was a private business. So much more money and so much less output. And so with regards to CMR Surgical, it seems like there's something here that the UK is potentially world-class at, maybe something that could help make our healthcare system more productive. And I just love to see us be aggressive about implementing that type of technology and similar tech, scale it up in hospitals, improving productivity of our healthcare system and improving our UK tech base. I mean, it seems like such a win-win. So yes, Lomax, I'm with you. Kind of a $1 billion exit is appealing, but wouldn't a $1 billion, £1 billion NHS order be much more exciting?
Yeah, it is. I agree. It's a depressing story. Oh my God. But one thing I will say in reading, just spending more time on Intuitive, what a beast that company is. That company IPO'd in, I think, 97, 98. If you had bought, it's up 13,500% since IPO. Yeah. If you put $10,000 into the IPO, it'd be worth $1.35 million today. And you know what's fascinating about Intuitive? 180 billion market cap. It's only raised an external equity, which is both pre-IPO in the private market, IPO, and then beyond, about 750 million in equity, and it has basically zero debt. It's unbelievable. What an absolute beast of a company. It has got a 70 to 80% sort of, market share. Yeah. But come on, guys. Is this not possible?
It's one of Thiel's monopolies. There you go. 0 to 1 in the real world.
If you take, surgical robots has its own idiosyncrasies, but it's an aggressive M&A kind of market. I'll give you an example. So Auris Health was founded in 2007, raised $700 million, which is basically doing surgical robot for lung, particularly lung cancer, right? It got to 5 million of revenue, and J&J bought it for up to 5 billion. Right? The Lux Capital did it in the US. I know, it's insane, yeah? And so the M&A in that kind of market is aggressive. There are big med device companies like Stryker, J&J, Medtronic, etc., that will actually buy. And I just feel like there's something going on at this company, CMR Surgical, that doesn't quite smell right. And to raise $1 billion and then sell for $4 billion, that's not an amazing outcome.
Are you saying that the tech just isn't good enough?
I just don't know. I mean, clearly they haven't made headway into the US market, which, is the biggest healthcare market in the world. They've tried to go for emerging markets because they don't have a full-on robot. They actually have this robot arm that actually is better in smaller hospitals and also in emerging markets. So it's a slightly different kind of commercial strategy. But there's something that isn't quite right there, and they can't raise the money, and they're looking to sell. And, great, there's a 4 billion exit, but, what could have been? So, maybe, look, if we were sitting here 10 years ago, we would have been talking about an exit, DeepMind, which sold for 400 million. So the numbers have gone up 10 times. The context is both, we are leaving stuff on the table, but at least we're leaving a bit less on the table now, I guess.
Not quite as shit. Is that what we're going with?
Great. I think so.
Let's end on a high, because it's been very defense and negative Nancy this week, but we are going to end on a high. Now, my deal of the week was Helsing, which you kind of covered. Daniel Ek putting in another 600 million euros. Whether this is a good or a bad thing, I'm very anti-war. I hate the thought that it feels like we've gone back 10 steps on a humanitarian basis, but I also know that, we have to do what we have to do. I wish them every success. Lomax, you've got a deed of the week. What's yours?
Yeah, over in health again, but this time software. So Nabla, an AI ambient scribe for doctors. So you're sitting there in your consultation, doctor and patient. It will ambiently in the background take notes and then do lots of clever things off the back of that. It's effectively an advanced medical grade version of what we use, fireflies, etc. That's a problem that actually a lot of people have tried to tackle over the last 10, 15 years. A lot of them slightly more going back a generation of technology, the kind of text to script technology that Nuance, which ended up actually, to be fair, got bought by Microsoft for 20 billion, although medical was only a part of it. LLMs have been a big unlocker here for the industry. And now there are a number of startups that are sort of at the Series B, Series C, Series D level. 2 or 3 of them are in the US. But actually, this Paris-based company called Nabla, founded by ex-Meta engineers, has now raised a $70 million Series C, taking total amounts raised to $120 million. ARR is up 5 times in 6 months, now supporting 85,000 clinicians across 130 plus health organizations. Mostly, the revenues in the US, 90%, which, to be honest, as you would expect, as I said earlier, 20% of US GDP is spent on healthcare. The healthcare budgets in the US are insane. So not surprising that the go-to-market is in the US there, but it's a good example where LLMs have enabled a new wave of startups to tackle a problem that people have tried to tackle before, but actually the technology is now at the level of maturity where it can be done in a smarter, more cost-efficient way. It's good because, AI and software technology within healthcare can take a very, very long time. This is a big market, $25 to $30 billion market. And so good luck to these guys. And they're out of Paris. And, it's good to see that. It's my deal of the week.
Deal of the week. Mads, anything else happening with you this week, my man?
We spoke briefly about Scale AI last week, I think. And I'm going to bring it back again because Zucky is, yes, he's not taking any prisoners here. He's been spraying around money like nobody's business. And specifically to the Scale AI deal, which was, I think, a $15 billion deal, give or take. It was announced last week. Docs were signed within the week, and money was wired this Monday.
Wow. There you go.
Okay, so investors had cash in their hand within a week of this hitting the press. I think it is the fastest major acquisition for cash to flow ever. It was not a proper acquisition. You could say it was more of an acqui-hire with an investment and some other sprinkles on top.
Gagging for some engineering resources, isn't he, old Zuckerberg?
Yeah, like that's an amazingly quick deal. But let's not forget, one of the reasons why that's happening is this did not require FTC consent in the US, which, the Wiz deal, which we talked about, $33 billion in Q1, isn't going to close until next year. Right? Because that's got FTC, and obviously Figma ended up not closing. So
we see situations where it's hard to get cash to flow in a £500,000 seed round within 4 weeks. So this is just the legal team that's been on this one.
I just want to see the bank accounts, when that kind of money moves.
Notwithstanding FTC, that is actually incredible. And I was lamenting last year, looking at some of our companies getting a term sheet and not closing for 3 or 4 months. Obviously, there's no regulatory consents for any of that. It's total BS. It's literally BS. Well, funnily enough, lawyers in the US ain't cheap, but if you restrict them to working for 1 week only, then at least you cap the number of hours they can work. So yeah, European lawyers can work for 6 months to close a deal. They'll probably rack up the same number of fees. That's a really good point. Really good point, Mads. There's something in the water in the US.
It's all good. It's all good. We won't have them soon. Don't worry, guys. I just wanted to say all the best to Alex DePledge, who's been hired by Rachel Reeves. I don't know if you know Alex. She's a super cool entrepreneur, founder, who's now working with government as the UK Entrepreneurship Advisor. So I only heard that today, and that's the 19th.
Good luck to her. She's got her work cut out, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's possibly a thankless job, but it's great to see real world founders, business people.
And actually,
government.
you reflect on that, like what Matt Clifford has achieved with his AI opportunities plan, which his bullet. I don't know, Mads, how many bullets there were in his plan, but it was 100 or something. But getting that adopted in full and actually within 8 months. And as we talked about, the Edinburgh supercomputer in August last year being cancelled and now being uncancelled, right? Which was, for me, a big one in terms of scaling up the UK's compute capacity at the research level. Actually seeing founders, entrepreneurs, general partners and venture funds actually making a difference within 12 months in government, you probably would have felt was unheard of in the past, no?
I think there's something a bit Doge-esque about, more business people. Listen, hold
Careful.
judgment aside for a second. I know. Judgment aside for a second, but maybe there's this license being given. So Trump, for all his unpleasantness and all of the other challenges that we have with a character like him, he has given the world permission to maybe engage government, public, private sectors in slightly different ways.
What's very interesting is when this used to happen, and this used to happen in the 2000s, whatever, there was always the pejorative term czar that was used in the sort of business czar or whatever, like the kind of AI czar. And actually, you don't see that anymore. You still see the word czar used in other terms where the press is trying to be pejorative, but actually it's not used in the context of business and technology anymore. So actually, that's probably a good sign.
I think so. I think also there's a lot more going on behind the scenes that just doesn't hit the press anymore, which is I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. It would be great to see more business people supporting governments about business. It just kind of makes logical sense to me. I know it's they often don't want to be in the
careful
public
because
eye.
99% of the population don't agree with you on that. But yes, we
Sure.
Sure. But actually, I don't know. I mean, this is anecdotal, but the amount of times I've opened LinkedIn to find some founder or GP standing outside number 10, including you, my man, Mads, is definitely up and to the right, and in the highest it's ever been in the last 10 years. So
You can blame social media for that.
well, true.
What have we missed, Jens? What else is on your minds that we should have talked about?
Let's do some deals.
Do you know
Let's
what?
make some magic.
No one went to Zuck, obviously poaching, trying to spend a gazillion dollars on poaching OpenAI crew. But maybe we can just fold that into the deal.
Well, no, I think clearly what happens in the football, which is a very European thing in the football markets now in Europe and the UK, is now happening in the AI markets in the US, where you're seeing, $100 million signing bonuses and transfer fees for high profile developers, and it's I guess poaching, level 7 or whatever level it is developers that has been going on for years, but doing it with these kind of price tags is unheard of. But it's a sign of the times,
here's
guys.
Here's the irony, right? These were the very guys that were probably left last on the queue to be chosen for the football teams when they were at school. Yeah. So they've got their moment in the sun.
Although I suspect a lot of it's in stock at kind of record prices for these companies that may end up going down. So yeah.
We'll
see.
All power to all of them. Let's just make.
Well, I
some
don't
good
know.
products.
I mean, Meta. Look, I mean, why is Meta doing this at the moment? I mean, look, certainly Zuck, I think, feels like he's starting to miss out and is worried about getting left behind. So actually, maybe if they do miss the boat here, that stock won't be worth as much as the 100 million or whatever it is they're being offered at today. So I think that is something that he's clearly. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Yet again, the guy has navigated a number of platform shifts through mini platform shifts
and mega
modality
purchases
shifts
that were all laughed at the time.
all after at the time.
Well, let's as Mads says, let's go and do some deals. I will catch you lovely people next week.
See you next one.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.